What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video. In this video, I'm going to be building an awesome RTX 3060 based gaming PC build, featuring some really great components built in a lovely case with plenty of airflow. This is a really nice system for not only the holiday season this year, but also the whole of 2022. In today's video, I'll be running you through all the components I selected and why, the build process from start right through to finish, before testing the system out later in some of the biggest and latest AAA titles, including Forza Horizon 5 and Battlefield 2042. Let's do this. As with all of my build videos, I'm going to kick things off by looking at the core components to begin with. This includes our RAM or our memory, our CPU or processor, the M.2 SSD drive, and of course, the motherboard. Now for this build, I've tried to get the best value components possible, to give you guys as much money as possible left to spend on the GPU. That's super important in the current climate, and will make your build process that little bit more feasible as far as price goes. Now for the motherboard, I've gone for this B550M gaming board from Gigabyte. Though to tell you the truth, any of their budget B550 boards will work a treat. With support for the latest Ryzen 5000 CPUs, a reinforced PCIe lane, Gen 4 M.2 support, and basically all the key features we could want on a budget, it does the job really nicely. And pairs up well with this, the Ryzen 5 5600X, the CPU choice for our build today. Now this might seem like an unusual choice, especially in light of our recent coverage of the new Intel 12th gen launch. Intel have well and truly killed AMD as far as straight performance goes, but motherboards are still a piece more expensive, at least until Intel bring out the cheaper, better value chipsets, and those chips run quite hot, meaning you do need to pick up a more expensive aftermarket cooler. That does make the build process a bit more pricey, meaning Ryzen wins out today for this more budget-oriented system. I'll be pairing up our CPU with 16GB of XPG Spectrix D45G. 3600MHz speed is important for Ryzen processors, something this RAM satisfies quite nicely, and it's dual channel, meaning you get not one, but two DIMMs. This gives your processor extra bandwidth, something once again that AMD processors in particular find to be more useful. Going ahead and installing the memory is pretty simple. Find the notch on the RAM DIMM, line it up with the DIMM slot on your motherboard, and pull back the retention clips on either side. Slide your RAM into place, applying a bit of pressure, and it will click really nice and easily. Simply repeat this for as many of your RAM DIMMs as you've got, a little something like that, and your memory is installed. Next up is the SSD or the storage. I'll come back to our CPU cooler in a moment. This right here is XPG Spectrix S20G. This is also an RGB component in the build, alongside the memory, and gives us some fast storage that doesn't break the bank. With these new RTX 3000 cards, you do need at least a Gen 3 NVMe drive, as anything slower will bottleneck the GPU. For a build like this one though, a 1TB or 500GB Gen 3 NVMe is going to work perfectly. To install it into this motherboard, it's actually a very slightly different process than normal. You still want to go ahead and locate this little M.2 screw and unscrew it with a smaller screwdriver, often referred to as a teeny tiny screwdriver here on the GeekaWhat channel. Similarly to your RAM or your memory, you want to line the notch on the M.2 drive with the notch on your motherboard. But for this video, this slot is actually upside down, meaning the XPG logo is technically the wrong way round. But that is okay. Aesthetically, I think it's completely fine, and performance-wise, it makes no major difference. Secure the drive back down. You haven't actually got to install an M.2 standoff in this build, as it comes pre-installed on the motherboard, and the drive just sits more flush with the board itself. I mentioned that we would come back to the CPU cooler, and that time has come. This right here is the Cooler Mater Hyper 212 RGB Black Edition. Specifically, this is actually the Phantom Gaming version that has some accents of red, though the standard RGB looks basically the same and performs equally strong. The Cooler Mater Hyper 212 back in the day was one of the most legendary coolers out there. It's basically a $25 cooler, though pricing can obviously change day to day, that provides much better performance than the stock cooler and gets close to some budget liquid options without breaking the bank. Inside the box, you not only get the cooler itself, but you'll also find yourself one of these. This right here is a plastic backplate. We're going to use this to fasten the cooler through the motherboard. Simply flip your motherboard around, take the backplate and pop it through the 4 holes on the underside. Then pop your motherboard back the right way round on top of your motherboard's box. This will stop the backplate from going anywhere. Add on these female to female screws around each corner to secure the backplate into place, before finally adding a drop of thermal paste. This does come included with your CPU cooler, and fastening the heatsink itself down on each of the corners, and that's basically it as far as the CPU cooler goes. With our motherboard assembly, as we call it, all nicely complete, it's time to move on to the case choice today. Now, this chassis might seem like a little bit of a peculiar choice, given that I've gone for a smaller form factor micro ATX motherboard. Truth be told, while this is a full-size ATX case, the Cooler Mater Masterbox TD500 Mesh isn't particularly massive for its size, and it does give you a bit more room to build in. Support for long graphics cards is important, and a mesh front panel ensures plenty of airflow and some nice and cool temperatures. Plus, the tempered glass side panel looks absolutely awesome, and the case's customizable RGB really let you fine tune it to get it looking exactly how you want. When it comes to installing the motherboard into the case, you can go ahead and remove as many of the side panels as possible. Not only the glass side panel, but the rear panel and often even the front panel will just make the case that bit easier to work with. Go ahead and lay the case down flat on a table, that way you're not fighting gravity when it comes to installing your motherboard, which will make things a bit easier. Before we screw the motherboard in, we actually need to grab this, our rear I/O shield. We're going to clip this into the rectangular cutout at the back of the case. These can be a little bit sharp, so do be careful with them. And you want your audio ports on the left-hand side, just here towards the bottom, next to where our graphics cards are going to be. You then want to grab your motherboard and locate all of the standoff holes. This is something we need to check before screwing it in. In this board, you'll find 2 holes at the top, a further 2 holes across the middle, and then a further 2 along the bottom. These should line up perfectly with 2 holes at the top of the case, 2 across the middle, and then the ones at the bottom are currently missing. So we need to add a standoff in here and here. Once those are in, we're free to screw the motherboard itself in, with the center raised standoff holding it in place as we secure it down, making the whole process actually nice and easy. While the case is flat on the desk, I think it also makes sense to install the GPU. This is a pretty good time in the video to actually do it, as everything's a bit more easy to access. This right here is a Gigabyte Aorus RTX 3060. Now, I know the current GPU situation is a bit messy, but if you can get your hands on a 3060 at anywhere near-ish to MSRP, you'll find yourself being pretty chuffed. We've been impressed with the 3060 in our coverage on both the website and the YouTube channel, both of which you can find in the card section now. This card has got 12 gigabytes of video memory, so plenty of VRAM for the latest Battlefield, Forza and COD Vanguard titles, and the Aorus triple fan cooler will help to make the case feel a bit more full. Something I'm conscious it doesn't quite look like, given how much empty and dead space we appear to have. To install the GPU, you want to go ahead and just line the graphics card up with the PCI retention slot, and then apply a bit of pressure, mainly with your left but also your right hand, until it clicks into place nice and securely. You then want to fasten it down with a screw just here. That will stop it from wobbling about, and we can deal with powering it up in just a moment when we look at the power supply. Speaking of which, this right here is the Cooler Mater MWE 650 Gold V2. Now, this is a 650 watt 80 plus gold certified power supply, with plenty of wattage to make our build tick over nicely, and a fully modular interface where we can choose to plug in only the cables that we really need to. For this build, you want to go ahead and grab yourself one of these. This right here is a SATA power connection and will power up the RGB fans up front of the case, plugging it into the modular power supply interface. You'll also want to pick yourself up 2 6+2 pin PCIe power harnesses. That's these bad boys right here, and these plug up to our PCIe/CPU section of the power supply. Nice and easily, like this. Lovely stuff. The largest cable of the bunch, the 24-pin power cable, is the next one I picked out of the box and plugs up just to the far end of the power supply and will power up in a moment's time the motherboard, but I'll talk you through that in just a second. Finally, the last cable we need is one of these, an 8-pin CPU power connector. Now, this right here will go to the top left of our motherboard and plugs up to the power supply nice and easily. The PSU will slide into the rear of the case without too much trouble, just down here. Move your front panel cables out of the way for now, and very neatly tuck the PSU into the rear of the chassis. The power supply will then fasten down nice and easily with 4 screws, one on each corner, situated at the rear. I'll spin the case around just so you guys can get a slightly better view of the 4 screw locations using the largest hexagonal screws that we get included with the case. We can then go ahead and wire up our 24-pin motherboard power cable. This goes to the kind of top right-hand side of the motherboard. A little something like this. The graphics card power connection, which goes to the center of our Aorus RTX 3060. That just requires 6 plus 8 pins there as well. So we've got spare 2 pins. Don't worry about those. We can tuck those and maybe cable tie that out of the way later. Before finally plugging up the CPU power connector to the top left of the motherboard to finish our power cables off. To wrap things up nicely as well, we also need to plug up some of our front panel connectors. That's to make the ports on the top of the chassis work as planned. The largest USB 3 cable is first up and is notched, so it only goes in one way round. Our HD audio follows closely behind. This has a pin blocked out and goes to the bottom left of the motherboard, making the headphone and mic jacks work nice and easily. Finally, you've also got your JFP1 front panel connectors. These are for your power, reset switch, all that jazz, and they're the fiddliest cables of the bunch. They go to the bottom right of the motherboard using the diagram on your screen now. With that though, our build is basically there and it's ready to be booted up for the first time and tested in some of my favourite titles and some of your guys' favourite games as well. Before that though, I think it's time to see how good it looks in customary GeekaWhat montage style in the only way we know how. I'll see you shortly, but first, roll that montage.
Yeah, you can take me there.
Nicely done. So we've established just how good this PC looks, but what about the performance? These are the all-important numbers that you guys really care about, and I'm glad to report we got some great results. On your screen now, as always, is a summary of all the different numbers we managed to get on this system, and we'll be taking a closer look title by title in just a second. If you enjoy these videos though and want to see more of them, make sure to get subscribed. It really, really does help us out. Looking at some of our titles more closely then, the first of those is GTA 5. Here at 1080p high settings, we got 141 frames per second on average, with 132 and 120 for the 90 and 99th percentiles. It was a similarly positive story in Battlefield 2042, where at 1080p medium settings with DLSS set to performance mode, we got 111 frames per second. As always, the frame rate was tested with both MSI Afterburner's Riva Tuner and Nvidia FrameView for maximum fairness. Moving on to Call of Duty Vanguard at 1080p, here at 1080p high settings, we got just shy of 120 frames per second on average. Now, there's no real reason in our opinion to tune down to medium or low settings, as this frame rate is plenty good enough, and visually the game looked great. Talking of games that look visually fantastic on this machine, Forza. Specifically, the brand new Forza Horizon 5. I love the Forza Horizon series, the game looks incredible, and the built-in benchmark mode is always a good test of performance. Here we got 91 frames per second at 1080p Ultra. That's more than enough for a racing game where frame rate matters far, far less, with consistent 90 and 99th percentiles too. Moving on to Halo Infinite, at 1080p medium settings, we got 105 frames per second on average. As the next title on our list, Halo looked really, really fantastic, and is part of some of the new titles that have just been released alongside COD, Battlefield and Forza Horizon 5. Moving on to a title that's slightly older but arguably a bit more popular, Apex Legends. Here we tested out at 1080p high settings and got an impressive 135 frames per second. A really, really great result and perfect for that first-person shooter landscape. Next up is Valorant. Here at 1080p high settings, we got over 400 frames per second on average. That's right, 404 FPS on average, with really great 90 and 99th percentile results, as is to be expected. The penultimate title on the list is a bit of Fortnite. Here at 1080p competitive settings, we got 290 FPS. We very nearly broke the 300 frames per second mark, which, I mean, let's be honest, is absolutely ludicrous. And visually, the game actually, for 1080p low settings, looked really good. Finally then, to wrap things up, we also tested out a little bit of Warzone. If Vanguard's not your thing, Warzone might be, and here at 1080p high, we got just a shave away from 120 frames per second. Wow. And with that, that pretty much wraps it up for the benchmarks today and the whole video. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to get subscribed. Thanks a lot for tuning in though, and as always, we'll see you soon.